Welcome to Table Talk and Tumbleweeds,
Coming to you from beautiful downtown Wheatland, Wyoming.
where the wind is strong.
And the spirit is stronger.
I'm Pastor Joshua of Covenant Lutheran Church.
And I'm Pastor Lisa of the Wheatland United Church of Christ. Table Talk and Tumbleweeds is a weekly discussion that focuses on local issues and concerns in the context of the Christian faith.
And vice versa.
Exactly, because we believe that the gospel meets people where they are, and where we are is rural Wyoming.
This show is about what the world looks like in this place, what our faith offers this community, and what this community has to teach the rest of the church.
You can find us at KYCN 92.7 at 11:30 every Monday.
And if you miss a show, or if you want to listen again, you can find us at Table Talk and Tumbleweeds, wherever you get your podcasts. We also have a website with all this information, which is ttandt.org. For today's show, we're going to be talking about Wheatland UCC, which claims to be the oldest church in Wheatland.
It is.
So you are a pastor at Wheatland UCC, is that right?
I am.
And how did you get to become pastor there?
It's probably not that long a story. I mean, I could make it a long story, but basically, Dorothy and I moved here during COVID to take care of her parents because they were not entirely mobile. And then while I was here, the Wheatland UCC was looking for a pastor. And I've been to seminary, my Lutheran background, but I've been teaching for a number of years since then. And so they asked me to do some supply preaching, and I did. And after I did that for a little bit, they were like, maybe. And I debated in my head for quite a while, but ultimately I really felt the sense of call for that. So yeah, I eventually accepted the call, and then I have standing now in the UCC, transferred over from the Lutherans.
So you got here. You did spend quite a bit of time in academia then.
I did.
So I'm sure it's different in many ways, but are there ways that surprise you how it's different to be in a congregation instead of in academia?
I mean, on the one hand, they're totally different animals because academic questions, well, I mean, the biggest thing is I really, I could always just give my students F's. You don't really get to do that as a pastor. Well, at least not as a UCC pastor, maybe in more hierarchical sort of churches. So I mean, the thing that's the same is that there's people, there's people and they have questions. You are tasked with helping them come up with answers. The methods are different. I don't get to footnote the spirit when I'm writing a paper. Sometimes I wish I could. And I think the power dynamics are much more complicated in the clergy than they are in academia.
Now, you claim that you're not an academic anymore.
I don't think of myself as an academic anymore, but I still dabble.
Academia must have, in some ways, influenced the way that you actually do teach and preach.
I would say that what my academic background, and not just teaching, but before that, I've got a PhD in theology. I have a master's of divinity. I've written books on theology. I would say that what it brings to me is that when someone has a question, I don't just have the answer. I have many answers, right? So, and I think that's a real advantage. That's the thing I would say that trains me best for being a pastor is that if someone comes to me and says, this question, I don't say, well, here's the answer, just take it home and study it. It's much more providing context for them to develop what they think, right? So if someone wants to know about the Trinity, I might turn to Augustine and some of the arguments, Nicene Creed, some of the arguments that happen throughout really the 3rd, 4th, and 5th centuries, but also contemporary language that's used. Why is it necessary? So, some people say this, some people say this. And that, I think, has been helpful for me when people have come with questions. Why do people think this? I have a little bit of an understanding of some of the historical basis of it, but I also have an understanding not just of the tradition, but of the questions that accompany all the answers.
I always argue any question should first be interrogated to make sure it's the correct question, because if it's not the correct question, you will not get the correct answer.
If it's not, you should never get just the correct answer. I mean, I taught religious studies for however many years it was, and my students would sometimes be like, well, what? I mean, I could tell, especially I would teach these classes on ethics for the technology in the School of Engineering, and I remember one guy sort of saying, "Well, I wish you could. Is there just a way that you could just give us the answer?"
He just wants math.
Yeah, he wants math, and I was like,
He just wants to be able to say, add this, subtract this, and here's the answer.
and I was like, it's not rocket science, right? Because rocket science, there really is a way that if you do it this way instead of this way, it's just going to blow up. It's not going to work. But I will say that there are wrong answers in the humanities. There are wrong answers in theology, but there are also myriad right answers, right? And if there are, I think it's God has 1,000 names. And if you know 999, you got to keep looking, right? So if you just have one name for God and you want to cling to that one, boy, you are just missing out. So I think that's the thing that the spirit of inquiry that comes from having taught humanities, and I did a lot of literature as part of it, and I taught for did a Fulbright in Vietnam. And I remember teaching a short story by George Orwell, in which one of the first questions was, okay, what is the elephant a symbol for? And, I thought I had heard every answer that there was until I got to Vietnam. And then they had a totally different perspective because they were on the other side of George Orwell's story, right? Even though he was in Burma, it was very similar. So I was like, oh, yeah, there's always another way. And I think that's part of what in the UCC, this is what makes a good pastor, I think, is the ability to say, oh, and another thing, this idea that there are different ways to talk about God. Yes, there are wrong things that we can say about God, but there's also so many right things.
So saying there's just the one thing really misses out.
Right. You can say that one thing. I mean, it's just like the text is always there, right? The text is always there, but there are so many different ways that you can read it.
So this is really a part of the UCC then.
Yeah.
We might start wandering towards some more UCC history and practice.
Okay.
Now in UCC, none of those letters stands for Congregationalist. Is that right?
Yeah.
So that's one of the things we've already pointed out. So what does it mean that the UCC is Congregationalist?
And I think that is one of the things that the UCC still contains, even though not all of the bodies that come together into the UCC were Congregationalists. But what a Congregationalist setting, it's more of a polity, that the core of everything is the congregation. The congregation is the seat of power, if you will, in the UCC. Everything comes out of the congregation. And I think that is something that most people sort of miss about Congregationalism. And this is, and I will say, even as the UCC is sort of adding some bureaucracies to what they do, that core commitment, if the UCC ever loses its commitment to congregational polity, it will stop being the UCC. It will be something else. And part of that is that the basis of our unity is covenant. And covenant is, I promise to be with you if you promise to be with me. And a piece of that covenant is, God is part of that covenant. It's just not a two-way, it's more of a three-way covenant, if you will. But this is the very first UCC, the Mayflower Compact really is a covenant, right? This was the Puritans, the Pilgrims that came over, Puritans and Pilgrims, two different people. But the Mayflower Compact, although they both end up in the UCC. Anyway, so the Mayflower Compact is a covenant. It's we agree that we are going to get together and we're going to work together. We're going to do this. There's nothing in there that says, here's the creed, check off everything you agree. No, we are committed. The UCC, we say that Jesus Christ is the head of the church, and everything that we do relates to that. There's the Spirit, there's these other aspects of it, but the basis of it is covenant. So when you are called to a congregation, you make a covenant with that congregation. I agree that I will do this. You agree that we will do this, and then God becomes a part of that mutual promise. So any kind of relationship that happens within the UCC, and this goes all the way back when the UCC Church, or what was now the UCC Church here in Wheatland, was founded, the first thing that happened, 6 families got together and made a covenant. And what they made the covenant was, we are going to build a church. We are going to be faithful Christians. We are going to worship God. We are going to invite Christ to be among us. We are going to be led by the Spirit, right? So the covenant is the basis of unity, not creeds. And that, I would say, is the thing that unites everyone in the UCC, that we believe that the basis of Christian unity is the commitment of Christians, the unwavering commitment of Christians to continue to be faithful with and to one another, even as we're being faithful to Christ. And I remember one of the first things I was doing at a conference level, and there had been a lot of anger that had been going on in this conference at the time. This was several years ago. And people were called together in the room. They all agreed to show up. And there were people in that room that were really very angry with each other. And one of the exercises we were supposed to do is go around the room, and everyone was supposed to say something nice about other people in the room. So you had to go around the entire circle, right?
And these are people who are actively angry at each other.
Yes. Yes.
That's a challenge.
As we were going around the room, people kept saying to them, he shows up. He shows up. And at first I was like, that's kind of faint praise. You can say whatever, but he's still breathing. But then as I got more involved in the UCC, I go, no, that is the core of what it means to be a Christian. I think you are utterly and completely wrong.
But now let's talk about it.
Now let's talk about it. Okay. See you tomorrow. And that is the core of the UCC. We don't walk away.
And so that covenant commitment is what really defines how you think and who you are, regardless of the fights, the arrogance. The statement is, we're going to show up and we're going to figure this out.
We're going to show up, and we're going to show up because we are both committed to God, to Christ, and we are both committed to being led by the Spirit to find our way through this.
Which is quite a commitment in the modern world. Well, Wheatland UCC, you said 6 families got together and said we needed a church, and then they did. What prompted that?
Well, this was 1895. So Wheatland UCC is was the first congregation, the first church built in Wheatland. A couple of years earlier, they had built sort of the Wheatland Development Corporation or whatever, and so they were encouraging the people to come out. And this was part of the whole push that comes after all the treaties that were signed when the territories were ceded, and that's a whole nother discussion. But you had this tremendous growth that was happening as people were moving into the area. People were homesteading. Land was being developed. And so in 1895, like I said, these 6 families got together in the schoolhouse and formed a covenant to create the church. They called a pastor. They got a grant from the Missionary Society. And they started building. So I think it took 4 months to build the church. And I think the Methodist church was completed soon after that. And then, so 1895 was us, 97, excuse me. Episcopal church was put in. And then a year after that, the Catholic church was put in. So there was this tremendous period of 3 years in which there's obviously this big growth of people coming into the area, farmers and ranchers and ditch diggers and everyone that was needed to sort of create this town. But I was actually looking through some of the Wheatland UCC stuff, and it starts with the Congregationalists, and I was looking through some of our history, and so I just had some interesting stuff. In 1901, the town of Wheatland had its first operation, which was an appendectomy performed on the dining room in a private home by a member of the Congregationalist Church.
By, not on.
By a member of the Congregationalist Church with a doctor who was assisting. Now, this is just what was written down. I have no idea how that came to be. Why, if there was, maybe the doctor crushed their hand or something. But anyway, there was an appendectomy with a doctor assisting a member of the Congregationalist Church. The other really interesting thing I saw was that in the records in 1900, it recorded the ordination of Miss Annette Beecher. Now, it's not clear to me whether it happened in this church or in Cheyenne, but this was a woman being ordained into the Congregationalist Church. She became, but what was important about her, that there was, so Annette Beecher, and then later, a couple years later, Annette Gray was called to be an interim pastor here while they got someone. And I was like, and then later there was Mrs. W.B.D. Gray who came. Well, apparently, this guy, W.B.D. Gray, was the missionary coordinator. I don't remember his title, but in Cheyenne. It does record that he was up here in 1900, but then it says, he was here in January, and then his wife died in October. And then all of a sudden you've got his wife showing up here 8 years later to be pastor. So clearly he marries Annette Beecher. Now, Annette Beecher, here's another Annette Beecher was a very important person in Frontier. She established a lot of churches. I mean, this woman would have been riding around on horseback, right? Going and establishing churches all the way through the territory. She was ordained, she was ordained in 1900s. Anyway, they have a whole archive of her stuff. And now, of course, I see, totally not an academic anymore. Nope. I want to go read this stuff. This is so interesting. But anyway, so this is. I mean, she was pastor here twice, for probably a total of a year and a half. So that's the oldest church in Wheatland, right? That is the Union Congregational Church. But then you have this other church that sort of comes in, and Union. I'll talk about that in a second. But the second church that comes in is the Bethlehem Evangelical and Reformed, which I think you and I were talking. Who were we talking to? Louise. After church on Sunday, and she keeps referring to it as the Reformed and Lutheran, and in my head I'm going, no, it's not. But she's right,
because she's German. Because this comes from the Prussian Union that happened at Wilhelm, one of the Wilhelms, that said, I'm tired of Reformed and Lutherans arguing all the time, right? So this eventually forms what becomes the Evangelical Kirche. So the Evangelical and Reformed Church becomes part of these Germans who came over that unite Lutheranism and Reform under one banner. And we don't need to go into. You and I can talk about the theology later. But so in the 1930s there was a group of Volga Germans, and the Volga Germans were Catherine the Great had brought some Germans over in the 1700s. Can't remember the dates. But in the mid 1800s, 100 years later, and as Germans do, they remained German. That is one thing. I taught a lot of history of the United States courses, and the one thing doesn't matter what denomination it was, those Germans were a problem, right? They were a problem in the Reformed Church. They were a problem in the Lutheran Church. They were a problem for Judaism. They were a problem for the Catholics. The whole American heresy. Germans. So you have all of these because the Germans wanted to do things in German. Right? Because why would you speak any other language other than German, right? Obviously, if you're going to do things in the correct, proper order, German. Yes.
My grandmother always insisted that, to do things. I'm pretty sure she thought Jesus spoke Hochdeutsch. So these these Germans had lived along the Volga River in Russia. The Catherine the Great dies, as people do, and the Russians were starting to want to sort of reestablish dominance in that territory. They began these persecutions, so they all left, bringing with them all of their Germanness. They came to the United States, and they were brought in as migrant workers for the sugar beets. So this is when sugar beets were really becoming part of the Wheatland agricultural scene.
Yeah, we had our own sugar factory.
Yes. And again, this was the conversation with Louise where she was talking about the camps, right? That they set up migrant camps, not just in Wheatland, but for these Volga Germans to come over. Well, within a generation, from 10, 15 years, they're like, well, we want our own church because we want to be worshiping in German. And that was why they wanted their own church. So they wanted to set up their own church. So in 1931, they formed Bethlehem Evangelical and Reformed Church because they wanted their services in German. So there's this sort of interesting thing that happens because the UCC is 5 main streams. It's the Congregational Church, and those are the New England Puritans, the Pilgrims, the people that come over. And the second one is the Christian churches. And those were the frontier churches. And although it's not official, when I was reading some of the records, in the Congregational Church, they talked about using the Christian church building for a while. And so I think eventually the Christian church must have, they probably had a very close partnership. So I'm not sure what happened to the Christian churches here, but they might have been part of the merger in 1931 between the Christian churches and the Congregational churches. And then there was the German-speaking churches, right, which was the Evangelical Church, and then the other one was the Reformed Church, right? So those were German as well. So you have the English-speaking, the German-speaking, and then you had the other stream is the African-American church. So there was a very strong presence of African-American congregations to become part of the UCC. They start coming in and associating with the various congregational churches, and then when the big merger happens in '57, they all become part of this. So the interesting thing is that you have all of these different streams, all of them except for the African-American churches, are represented in the Wheatland United Church of Christ, which I find very, very interesting.
And each stage is a new covenant.
And each stage there's a new covenant and arguments, years and years. It takes several years hashing it over because, well, I mean, this is both the strength and the weakness, and why people have to stick with it, right? Because you have this sort of interesting thing that happens where you have the congregational piety, right, in which the congregation is everything, and congregation is like, no, we choose our pastor, and we're going to choose this person. Sometimes we'll call someone, sometimes we'll elevate. Hey, how about that woman down in Cheyenne? She can come up here. Hey, we're going to ordain a woman, right? So you have this sort of thing that what a congregation wants to do is what a congregation does.
So there's no top down, there's no thou shalt not.
Right. So they might be trained, but probably not in seminary. And then you get these Reformed Germans coming along, and they're like, oh no, they must go to seminary, right? So they're, the Germans are very big on education, right? So you have this sort of tension that emerges right there because you have a lot of clergy reverence among the Germans that is not.
Well, this is where we might talk about maybe a different time, but Henry Melchior Muhlenberg, the first Lutheran pastor in the North American continent, they sent away from him because they wanted somebody who'd been to seminary.
So this is part of that tension within the UCC of sort of the bottom up and the top down. And a lot of the early discussions of the organization had to do with ordination, right? Because the problem with bringing someone from the bottom up is, well, what do you do if they're abusing their authority, right? How do you do that? Who do you turn to? And so you like the fight over the guy dropping his card off at the bar, right? And they're, half the congregation is up in the arms, and the other one is going, well, I saw the card there, and that's why I'm here. So you have these different polities and these different pieties, but I think the thing that marks them is independence, and in every case, and then that's the frontier, right? That's the frontier. Those people out there don't tell us what to do, so that every congregation is. And I think this is one of the things that most people misunderstand about the UCC, right? Because they think, oh, this is that liberal church. And yes, the urban centers of the UCC still very radical, right? It's this part is not new, right? The same, the Women's Christian Temperance Union ordaining women in 1900s, they're still doing that. But this is that commitment to independence, and I don't think it's going to change because nobody from either the national office, the conference office, or the association comes to us and tells us what we have to do, what we have to believe, other than Jesus Christ is the head of the church. And that's it. And I think that's something that people really don't understand about the UCC. And like I said, I think they are being very careful as they attempt to put together frameworks, bureaucracies that will help coordinate things sort of nationally, of making sure that those bureaucracies don't have authority in the sense of telling people what you can and can't do. Most major denominations in the United States, whether it's the Methodist, Lutherans, have been really moving much more towards a top-down structure in which these big offices can tell everyone, you can't do that, you can't do that, you can't do that. And if you do this, we will kick you out and we'll take your church, right? And we'll take your building when we do it. It doesn't matter what side of the issue that I'm on, right? It makes me really, that is the part that makes me really uncomfortable because that is the part of me that's, sort of like really drawn to the UCC, right? Which is, no, that's not the way we do things. That's not the way Christians do things.
200 years of Congregationalist polity can't be wiped away because we think it might be more convenient.
Yeah. And it wouldn't necessarily be more efficient or wouldn't fit into my preconceived notions of what God does and doesn't want, right? So Jesus Christ is the head of the church. That is the commitment for unity, right? We say that, we are committed to being together because we're Christians, not because of this doctrine or that doctrine, right? And it's not even unity of practice, because I can go to different UCC congregations. I mean, we're fairly liturgical. I suspect that is the influence of those Reformed people. We're fairly liturgical, but not overly so.
You could certainly go higher church than you are now.
I could go, if I drop something, we just go, oops, and then we sort of shrug and we pick it up, and on we go, and so there's not, yeah. So, but then there's this thing that the UCC says, the radical welcome, that is a very UCC thing. But the other thing is this idea that God is still speaking.
And that's the part that is really tied into being non-creedal, because creeds shut God up, right? And this is where Luther comes in, right? Because Luther talks about the spirit and the flesh. Any doctrine can become dead letter if you stop letting it speak to you. Let the spirit speak through it, right?
And so this is where you talk about Gracie Allen. Don't put a period where God has put a comma.
Or an ellipses. There's this, so God is still speaking, and I think another way, another thing I've heard people say is, our faith is 2,000 years old, but our thinking is not. Our thinking is still fresh. We're still looking at what, it goes back to being in the humanities, right? That, the text is there, it doesn't change, and yet every time I read it, it breathes new life into me. That's the spirit, right? And you don't get the spirit if you're trying to impose this idea or that idea.
Well, what would you say to somebody who doesn't go to church at all? What would make them happier to be where you are instead of, say, the golf course?
That's a good question. I mean, I think that the answer that sort of comes to my mind right away is like this community, this place of belonging. But you can do that at the golf course. But I think the Wheatland UCC, and I think this is something that's probably true of all congregational churches. I think it's a place where you can bring your questions. And I used to joke that, some churches have in front of them, you've got questions, we've got answers. And I think for us, it's more like you have questions, so do we. Let's ask them together. But ultimately, as you go through your life, those faith questions you have about meaning and purpose and trying to get yourself right by God, if I can be, kind of a little old-fashioned in the way, to make that connection with each other and God, because those are intertwined. It's in Scripture, but really doing it in a place in which it's okay not to go on. I don't know. It's okay to come in your flip-flops and your shorts. It's also okay to not have all the answers when you come in the door. It's okay to not, to not accept the answers when you come in the door. It's just a place where you can come and rest with your questions and rest with your doubts. Okay, that's our show for the day. I'm Pastor Lisa from the Wheatland United Church of Christ. We worship Sunday mornings at 10 a.m., and we are located on the corner of 11th and Walnut.
And I'm Pastor Joshua at Covenant Lutheran Church, which is at 18th and South Street. We worship at 9, and we'd love to have you. You can find us here every Monday at 11:30 on KYCN 92.7 or at Table Talk and Tumbleweeds, wherever you get your podcasts.
Table Talk and Tumbleweeds is a ministry of the Wheatland United Church of Christ and Covenant Lutheran Church, and is supported by an In the Mud grant from the United Church of Christ. We'll see you next week, and remember,
there's always room at this table.